matters we need to take up before we bring jurors?
Not from the state, no.
Let's go ahead and bring jurors up, please. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience. Sorry for the additional delay, but I believe we're now in a position to move forward with the next witness. Is that correct, Mr. Fawcett?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. The state would call Sandra Cooper to the stand.
Ma'am, if you would please stand and place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Mr. Fawcett?
Thank you. State your name for the court, please.
Sandra Cooper.
All right. Where do you live?
I live in Bowie, Maryland,
All right. And where do you work?
at Amtrak.
Okay. And what do you do for Amtrak?
A number of things. I am the administrator to the reservation system, which we called Arrow, and I'm also responsible for a team of 5 who test the reservation system for software implementation.
How long have you been employed by Amtrak?
31 years and counting.
Can you tell us your different duties you've had for Amtrak throughout those years?
I've worked on Auto Train. I've worked in the Washington ticket office. I've been a tester, a trainer, and now manager of the reservation systems.
As to the reservation systems, are you well familiar with the reservation systems of Amtrak?
Yes, I am.
Are you aware of how Amtrak keeps reservation records in the normal course of business?
Yes.
Are these records of reservation records made at or near the time of the events described in the records?
We archive our systems every 3 days after the initial departure date.
Okay. And are these records made and kept in the ordinary course of business?
Yes.
Okay. And what is the overall database, if it has a name, for the passenger reservations, and
TPF.
what does it stand for?
Basically, it's the language in which they store information. We back our systems up on an RTDS database, which is record transaction.
And what is the CISPROD unit?
CISPROD is where we house the information. It's a separate database.
Can I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
Show you what's marked as State's Exhibit 85. Do you recognize what State's Exhibit 85 is?
It's a copy of our PNR, passenger name record, or confirmation of travel.
And is State's Exhibit 85 a record that was made in the regular course of business at Amtrak at or near the time of the transactions described in State's Exhibit 85?
Yes.
And was State's Exhibit 85 also kept in the ordinary course of business of Amtrak?
Yes.
Can you interpret the State's Exhibit 85 based on your knowledge of the Amtrak reservation system for us?
Yes.
You know, at this time, the state would offer into evidence State's Exhibit 85.
Any objection?
No objection.
It's allowed.
Can you tell us what State's Exhibit 85 documents, please, the various transactions involved?
It's reservation 111D, as in David, 17, with a hold limit date of April 30th for Mr. Jonathan Broyhill. The reservation was made on our internet by a different individual other than a reservation agent. The reservation was made on April the 21st, 2013, again by the internet. The initial reservation was made for train number 73 from Raleigh to Charlotte to depart at 6:45 a.m. on April 24th to arrive at 9:55 a.m.
All right, let me stop you there, if you don't mind. The initial internet purchase of an Amtrak ticket, you stated occurred when?
It actually occurred on the 21st of April.
Okay. At what time?
Our system time says 9:25, but it was actually 6:25 p.m.
Okay. Let me ask you this. Let's start with April 21st, 2013. The ticket was originally booked.
Mhm.
And it says 9:25 p. Is that Pacific time?
Yes.
So Eastern time, that would be April 22nd at 12:25 a.m. Correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So April 21st, 2013 at 9:25 Pacific time, which would indeed, our Eastern time would be April 22nd at 12:25 a.m., right after midnight.
Yes,
All right.
that's correct.
That original ticket was purchased for a Amtrak departure leaving from where, going where, at what time?
Train number 73 from Raleigh to Charlotte at 6:45 a.m. on Monday.
Monday, April 22nd,
Correct.
2013. And that 6:45 a.m. would be Eastern time for the passenger, correct?
That is correct.
What time was it supposed to arrive in Charlotte that Monday, April 22nd, 2013?
I would need a train schedule. I'm not familiar with the train schedule from memory.
What was the name of the passenger this ticket was booked for?
Mr. Jonathan Broyhill.
You said this was an internet transaction?
Correct.
Was an email address provided?
Yes.
What was the email address?
The email address is i-jon.broyhill@gmail.com.
What was the price of the ticket?
The initial price was $34.
All right. How was payment made for that ticket?
Using a Visa card
All right.
ending in 2670.
2670. Okay. According to your record, State's Exhibit 85, what is the next thing that happens with that ticket was purchased to leave at 6:45 a.m. April 22nd, Monday morning?
After it was booked on the internet, it was a ticket was issued at the same time. The way the internet works is that once you've initiated travel, you must pay for it immediately in order to complete the itinerary. Following that, the reservation was then canceled for a no-show and rebooked for Tuesday, the 23rd, on the same train 73 from Raleigh to Charlotte.
Tell us about what the record, State Exhibit 85, reflects as to how it was rebooked after the no-show.
The person called our reservation office, and the reservation office in Riverside, California, spoke with a sales agent and changed the itinerary, and the sales agent reprocessed the information within a matter of minutes.
All right. Tell us what phone number, if the State's Exhibit 85 reflects as to the phone number that was utilized by the customer rebooking the ticket.
It would be our 1-800 number, is 1-800-872-7245.
The Amtrak number. And then on the front of State's Exhibit 85, the customer's number that made the call to the Riverside, California call center.
That information is not here.
Okay, may I approach the witness?
Yes, sir.
Ask you about on the front of the page. Can you tell me,
Oh, the numbers that were placed?
yeah, the 919 numbers?
Okay. The telephone numbers, the customer would have had to give the information to the contact center to let them know that they were the traveler. And the telephone number that was entered when they made the reservation on the internet is the same that the agent took, which is 919-332-4520, and it was a cell phone.
919-332-4520.
Correct.
Okay. And tell us when that call was placed from that cell phone number to the Riverside call center.
It
to
says
rebook.
It says 12:55 p.m. And again, that would be Pacific time.
So that would be 3:55 p.m. in the afternoon, Eastern time.
Correct.
And that call rebooking the ticket for Tuesday morning departure occurred on what date?
April 22nd.
Okay, April 22nd, which is a Monday, the
Yes,
previous information. Okay,
correct.
so Monday, April 22nd, a call from that cell number to Riverside processing system, rebooking this Amtrak ticket to leave Tuesday morning to Charlotte.
Correct.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Ms. Elliott?
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Ms. Cooper. I just have a few questions for you. The Amtrak policy on if you've booked a ticket and then the train has departed and you call to cancel, you are not able to get a refund. Is that correct?
In certain situations, they do make allowances if you cancel, or as in the record shows, no show. They will make allowances depending on the customer calling.
What is the general policy?
Normally, if you miss your train, your ticket turns into what we consider an e-voucher, and that e-voucher sits for possible use for approximately 365 days.
And an e-voucher simply means that you can't get the money back.
Correct.
But you can use it
For additional travel.
so you can rebook it.
Correct.
And use that credit.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
So and can you tell by looking at this ticket, or let me rephrase that, you can't tell by looking at this whether when Mr. Broyhill called that 800 number, whether he asked for a refund or whether he, what he was talking to the reservation person about, correct?
No, you'd have to listen to the call. They make copy of the calls that come into the call center.
Okay. So all you can tell by this is that when he called, the ticket, or let me ask you this: how long is there a period of time that you can call after a no-show that you are able to get a refund?
No, you can't get a
So-
refund. It always goes to a voucher if you do a no-show.
So as soon as the train departs, it turns into a...
No, there's a period of time that when you travel, the conductor goes through and lists the tickets with a handheld device. And he, at a point, makes a decision whether he has met his threshold of how many people are actually boarded and traveled. And then at some point, when your ticket has not been lifted, there is a utility that we have within the reservation system based on when the train status is entered, that the itinerary goes into a no-show.
Okay. So once the ticket is turned into a no-show, and it would have done that at some point, if the train was supposed to leave at 6:45 a.m. that morning, it would have done that sometime in the early morning hours of April 22nd.
Correct.
And the call was made to the reservation line at, I'm just going to use Eastern time, at 3:55 p.m. Eastern time.
Yes.
So that ticket was in no-show status. Is that correct?
Yes.
So even if, assuming no allowances were made, he would not have been able to get any refund, correct?
That's correct.
And so his only option at that point would have been able to get a credit for a future travel.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
May I have just a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
Just one other clarification. Ms. Cooper, you testified that this ticket was purchased, I believe the ticket shows at 9:25 p.m. That is Pacific time on April 21st.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yes.
Which would be 12:25 a.m. Eastern time on April 22nd, just after midnight, correct?
Correct.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Mr. Fawcett?
This was a one-way ticket, correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. You may step down.
Thank you.
Further evidence for the state?
Yes, Your Honor, the state we call Nation Han to the stand.
Sir, if you would, please stand, place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Mr. Fawcett?
Please state your name for the court.
Nation Han,
How do you spell your last name, Mr. Han?
H-A-H-N,
All right. How old are you?
28.
What do you do for a living?
I work for a marketing agency here in Raleigh,
All right. What's the name of the marketing agency?
New Kind.
How long have you held that
I started there in January of 2012.
Where do you live now?
I live in downtown Raleigh.
All right. In the beginning of April 2013, where were you living?
I was living at 1705 Tillwood Place in North Raleigh.
Who were you living with?
I was living with my wife,
What was her name?
Jamie.
After April 22nd of 2013, did you ever return to the inside of that Tillwood Place residence?
No, I did not.
Let's start, Mr. Hahn, with talking about your wife, Jamie. Why don't you share with us how you first met Jamie Hahn?
I was a student at UNC, and an email went over a listserv asking for volunteers for a presidential campaign. And so I showed up. I didn't meet her that night, but I kept emailing her, basically begging for a task to be involved. And so finally, I think out of exasperation more than anything, she gave me something to do. So I showed up. This was probably end of January 2007 for a fundraiser. And they led me back to her, and that's where I met her.
All right. Tell us about whether you got a position there helping with the campaign and the progression of meeting Jamie and the relationship.
Okay. Yes, I mean, at first I was just a volunteer, and I kept coming back. And really they couldn't get rid of me because I wanted to do the work. And at the time made also really good friends, including Jamie. Eventually she brought me on as her, or not she, the campaign brought me on as an intern for the campaign, and ultimately placed me with her. And so I was working at Jamie's discretion. So she was teaching me the ropes on fundraising. And after probably, I think around 2 to 3 months of working with her and working in the North Carolina portion of the campaign, I moved over to another fundraising portion, still interning. But we remained very good friends, and I would help her out on an ongoing basis.
Had she graduated from college?
She had.
Where did she graduate from? What year?
She graduated from the University of North Carolina in 2006.
All right. And you at that time, where were you?
I was at the University of North Carolina as a student as well.
Okay. What was Jamie's? She was older than you.
Yeah, she was 2.5 years older.
Okay. What was her birthday?
October 25th,
What year?
1983.
All right. While you're still in school now, you're volunteering at the campaign. What's the next thing that occurs as far as you and Jamie?
Well, we remained friends, and I had a huge crush on her, and to the point where I think sometimes she would ask friends if they would go along with us to not give me the wrong idea. But as time went along, we spent more and more time together, and we were each dating someone, and they both went off. You know, one went to New Hampshire for the campaign, and one went back to school. And she said, well, why don't you come over, and I'll make dinner, and we'll sort of cry over our partners that have gone off in their separate ways. And so she made pasta dinner, and we watched Harry Potter, and were seated like this close to one another. And I don't think we talked about the people that we were dating at all. In fact, I know we didn't. And so I just continued having a crush on her. I thought she was the most beautiful, remarkable person that I'd ever met. And we went out to lunch probably 3 or 4 times a week. We went out to breakfast a fair amount, or I would bring her breakfast. Sorry. And I remember, I think the time she really realized I had a crush on her was my family had taken me to a Cheesecake Factory for lunch. I was like, Jamie, do you want any cheesecake or anything? Let me bring you back anything. And she said no, but I still brought her back a piece of cheesecake anyways. And I think that was a clue to her as well.
At some point, were her feelings reciprocated to you and y'all started dating?
Eventually. So she went to work it was a much longer process than I would have wanted for her to reciprocate. She went to work for Senator Hagan, then State Senator Hagan, who was running for the U.S. Senate, and she was living in Greensboro. And so she would come back and forth and visit with us some. And she would later tell me that she started returning the feelings, and she was waiting for me to kiss her. I didn't see that, or I would have. there was one instance in late December where we went out to a bar with friends, and she drove me home, and we had one of those awkward moments where you both sat in the car with one another, and you're like, all right, good night. And she was like, good night. And I was like, well, I'll see you tomorrow or soon. And she said, yeah, me too. And then we just sat there. And I was like, well, good night. And she said, good night again. And then I got out of the car. And I think that was probably the specific night she wanted me to kiss her for the first time. But I was either too stupid or too cowardly to do it.
At some point, did you get your nerve up and?
I did. The presidential campaign ended. The candidate dropped out at the end of January.
Which year
And
is this now?
this was would have been in 2008.
Okay.
And the candidate and his spouse threw a thank you party for the staff. And this was, I think, Friday, February 1st, if I remember correctly, at Milltown in Carborough. And so we all went, and Jamie came into town, and everyone, was drinking beers and drinking wine and so on and so forth. And after John and Elizabeth spoke and thanked us for what we did for the campaign, we went out in the patio, and my recollection is she leaned in and kissed me. She might tell you a different story, or she would have. But we kissed that night, and from there started dating.
4.5 months later, what happens?
Well, so in May or early June, I ordered an engagement ring. We had gone down to see Deborah, Jamie's mom, on around Easter weekend, and Jamie told her, so this is the man I'm going to marry. And, I think Deborah was a little surprised because I was new on the scene. But about a month or two later, I ordered her engagement ring, and with intentions of waiting till like August or September or October. But the day it arrived, which was June 18th, I went up to FedEx. I'd had it shipped in, and I carried it around in my pocket. And as soon as I got back to the office, I showed a coworker, and because we were working together, Jamie and I was like, oh, man, I really want to ask her tonight. So I made her dinner, and we, and I think she went and got her nails done while I was cooking for her. And then we went down to the Battery in Charleston. But when we got down there, my nerves sort of got the better of me at first, so we just kept walking. And there wasn't really any clear reason for us to be walking. And she was like, well, I've got a headache. My feet are aching in these hills. You want to go home? And I said, let's just walk a little bit further. And then I got down on one knee and asked her. And then she was feeling better. She didn't have a headache, or her feet didn't bother her anymore. So, yeah.
Jamie grew up where?
In Orangeburg, South Carolina.
All right, and her parents?
She had her mother, Deborah Funderburg, and then her father and stepmother, Chris, and she called Teresa Risa. And then Marion, her stepfather, would come along when she was 13 or early teens.
Leading up, when were you and Jamie married?
April 18th, 2009.
2009.
9.
Where were you and Jamie living as the wedding approaches?
We were living in Charleston until the end of March, and then we moved from Charleston to Raleigh. I had gotten a job with the Sierra Club, and Jamie was starting a consulting practice.
All right. Were y'all working? What were y'all doing in Charleston before you moved back here?
I was doing freelance writing, and Jamie was waitressing. And then she started her consulting firm. She started working towards it that fall. And then in early 2009, she started looking for clients more formally, and she got her first client in, I think, February or early March, and they were based out of here. A few weeks later, I got the job with the Sierra Club, and we moved back to Raleigh.
All right. And in South Carolina, at some point, did both y'all work on another campaign?
Yeah, when we were engaged, we were both working on a congressional campaign.
Okay.
Or when we got engaged.
So now back in North Carolina, early 2009 as the wedding approaches. When was the genesis of Sky Blue? When did she start Sky Blue Strategies?
She started talking about it, speaking about it that fall with her former coworker from the Hagen campaign, and this probably was September, October. Beginning in November, December, those conversations really accelerated, including picking a name, and her coworker would get an offer to go work for Senator Hagen in her Senate office, and so Jamie was really at an impasse to decide whether she proceeded on her own or whether she, sought a partner. She decided to proceed on her own. And so she would get her first client or earn her first client in, again, I think it was late February, early March.
At
If I
your
remember.
wedding, who was your best man?
John Broyhill.
All right. If you would, tell us about when you first met the defendant, Jonathan Broyhill, and that relationship, please.
So summer of 2000, we were at church, went to the same church, Whitnell Pentecostal Holiness Church,
Where was this located?
in Lenoir,
Lenoir.
North Carolina. Yeah, and there was, and I guess I was 14, and I had a crush on this girl that went to church, so I started going to church more, at least more frequently, like Sunday nights, Wednesday nights, and and there was a church trip planned, I think, to Daytona Beach. And so I signed up because she was like, oh, you should come. And so I signed up. And I'd seen him before around the church because our families went to the same church, but I didn't know him particularly well. And on that trip, he was a chaperone of youth. And so he was in one room. I was in another room with an older guy who was a chaperone. And so over the course of that trip, we interacted. And I think that was really when we began to be friends.
Older is Jonathan Broyhill?
If I think he's 4 years older. I think he had just if I remember correctly, he just graduated from high school. I was going into high school and he had just graduated.
Y'all became friends?
We did.
You're now a freshman in high school.
Yeah, I was going into my freshman year.
What is Jonathan Broyhill doing as y'all become friends 4 years? He's out of high school?
Yes, he was. I think he was working at a paint store at that point. I know at some point around then he was working at a paint store. And he did that for a period of time because I can remember going by the paint store and visiting. He would later go back to Lowe's Foods. He had been at Lowe's Foods, then he was at the paint store, and then he went back to Lowe's Foods, all in that sort of time period.
Okay. Take us through the progression of your friendship with the defendant throughout high school and then after you graduate from high school.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we hung out semi-frequently, sometime, a couple of times a week, usually. I didn't have a license, and so, he would come pick me up, and, we'd go off and hang out with other friends from church, or sometimes the two of us would go, sometimes the two of us and my sister would go, just different occasions. Went out to eat a fair amount, sometimes to the movies, et cetera. And so we hung out quite a bit. I got my license, and I started hanging out with a lot of my friends who were in school more frequently. So I saw them less frequently, but we still would hang out or do things together semi-often, fairly often, I guess. And that continued until I went to UNC. When I went to UNC, we would see each other on major holidays and sometimes when I was home on summer break, but we did hang out a lot less frequently while I was in college. He came down to visit once or maybe twice. I think it was twice when I was there, sort of more towards my junior or senior year. He did come down. I remember he came down on election night freshman year, so I guess it must have been 3 times that I remember him coming to visit. And then I would just see him when I was home in Lenoir usually.
What do you know about the defense post-high school, any education or other jobs? You've mentioned a paint store and Lowe's Food. What else education job-wise are you aware of?
He had said he was going to mortuary school, or he was studying mortuary science. And I think I think he was taking some courses at Catawba Valley Community College, or he said he was, and he was taking, and I think he said that he had to travel occasionally to the eastern part of the state, because I think maybe it was a remote course through Fayetteville State or something to that effect. He started doing that. I can't remember when he started doing that, but that was sometime during my college career. He was studying mortuary science. I don't think he ever completed that degree. In fact, I know he didn't. He told us he was a few credits short. But
Any other higher education plans?
Not that I know of.
intentions that he had?
When we first met, he said he was discussing going out of state to college, to a 4-year school, but he didn't go there. No.
What do you know at this time in the story about his family?
His parents had split up I guess right before we became friends, or maybe it was ongoing while we became friends. So I would see his dad sometimes. I remember his mother was living south of us somewhere, and I remember actually going and seeing with him because he was going by, stopping by to see his mother for something, and so I saw her once or twice in the years that followed, but not frequently. But I would see his dad semi-frequently when we would go by their house.
What was his dad's name? What does dad do?
Ken Broyhill, he worked, I think, in textiles. I mean, he worked in some sort of furniture setting, but I think or a factory setting, but I think he was in the office, if I remember correctly.
At some point, his parents divorced, you think? Right?
Oh, they did. I think it was right before we became friends, or they were in the process of being divorced around the time we became friends.
And did either parent, if you know, get remarried?
I know his father did. His father would remarry in the years ahead. I can't remember exactly when, to a lady named Daryl. I don't know about his mother.
Does he have any siblings?
He does. He has a sister.
At some point, let's return back to Jamie and Sky Blue. Tell us about once it's up and running and about Sky Blue, please.
She set it up primarily to do fundraising. So the actual raising of the funds for campaigns or for nonprofits.
It wasn't solely political.
It wasn't solely political. No, it was nonprofits as well. I mean, her background was heavily political, but she certainly had a passion for nonprofits. And in fact, her first client was a nonprofit. Her second client was a congressional campaign in South Carolina, for whom she did far more. It was the Jane Dyer congressional campaign. And so on that campaign, she was sort of the term as a general consultant, i.e. like helping with strategy, field, etc. She started out as fundraising, then she moved into general consulting. She would ultimately sort of become the manager, even though she was still a consultant. And those were her first two clients. Her third client was a gentleman who was running for U.S. Senate, and that happened in June. I guess she picked him up in June of '09.
How about at some point, did your wife hire, well, tell us about Jamie first meeting the defendant, Jonathan Broyhill, how that connection starts.
My grandfather was ill, and so we went home to Lenore, where I'm from, to visit him in hospice, and so she came with me. And so we were with family, and then I called the defendant. I called him and another friend and said, I'd love for you to meet Jamie. She means a lot to me, et cetera. And so on our way out of town from seeing my grandfather at hospice care, we stopped by and had, a drink with him and another friend at her home, at the friend's home, at Julie's home.
Okay. At some point, does the defendant move to Raleigh?
He and Jamie became close pretty quickly. He came down and visited us in Charleston once. I think it was just once, and that was when he came out and told us both that he was gay for the first time. And Jamie was very understanding. I was too, but Jamie was very understanding, and immediately had already become friends with him, but became closer friends. And so he and some other friends would host an engagement party for us in Lenore, for example. But over time, we moved to Raleigh, and he would come down and visit periodically. And Jamie would always encourage him that, Raleigh's a great place to be. You should think about moving down here. I think you'd meet a lot of people you'd like. That summer, I guess it was late summer. This was 2009. He was working at that time for a company, Universal Mental Health. And they had a Raleigh office, and so he had applied for some jobs and didn't get them in here in Raleigh, and so he told us that he thought he could get a transfer, and then finally he did get a transfer. I don't remember exactly when. It was late summer, early fall. Jamie said, while you're looking for a roommate, you can use our guest bedroom, and he would, and then he ultimately found him a place to live. We helped him find a roommate.
Where were you and Jamie living at that point?
We were living in Cary at that point. Anyway, so they became very close friends as well. and hung out frequently. So he was working at Universal. He told us they had we helped him like put together his resume, for example, and he had a fair amount of like, accounting and finance background. At least that's the way it was presented on to us and on his resume. So anyways, fast forward to spring of 2010. She was just drowning at work. She's so busy. And she really needed an additional person to help her primarily with the Jane Dyer campaign. But the campaign couldn't afford to pay another person, so it would have to be sort of on her dime or on Sky Blue's dime. And she started thinking about the sort of cost-benefit analysis of bringing someone in. And as she thought about it, she knew that the defendant, he had always been interested in politics, or at least he had, certainly had the last several years. And he had, talked about wanting to get a political campaign. I think he had applied for a one or two sort of political or governmental affairs type jobs here in Raleigh and hadn't gotten them. But anyway, she made the decision. I don't remember exactly when. It was that spring to bring him on to help her with the workload, particularly with the Jane Dyer congressional campaign.
How long did the defendant work for Sky Blue? Is this like the part one of working for Jamie?
Yes, he went to work with her that spring and primarily on the Jane Dyer campaign. This necessitated the both of them being in South Carolina a fair amount, and ultimately late that summer he was playing a really heavy role with volunteers and field work being like going when people go door to door to knock on doors for political candidates, et cetera. So he was helping manage a lot of the volunteers and a lot of the field campaign side of things, while Jamie focused on sort of general strategy and fundraising. He had to move down there, or she asked him to move down there to be on the ground. And I think he moved down. The candidate provided housing. He moved down late summer 2010. And she had to spend a lot more time down there. She ultimately would stay down there the final month straight. But after that campaign ended, she only had one full-time client, and so she had to lay him off for a period of time. Now, he was a W-2 employee, so she was paying unemployment and Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, et cetera, for him. So he was able to draw unemployment. And so in the months that followed, she started proactively seeking new clients and tried to involve him as best she could in helping her in that endeavor. And so ultimately, she went to work, or Brad Miller's congressional campaign hired Sky Blue with the idea that both of them would be doing it. They jointly presented it to the congressman and his staff. And that was, I think, February or March. It was 2011. And shortly thereafter, she would bring him back on the payroll.
Once they landed.
Yeah, once she was paid, once they had received the contract, and then once she was paid, she was able to bring him back on after she was paid the first time.
Tell us, did you keep up with your wife's work and pretty well?
Yes, I was a huge political nerd as well. So even if she didn't want me to help her, I was trying to help her all the time. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Tell us then about the new client, Representative Brad Miller and Scott.
She had worked for Congressman Price, Congressman David Price, right out of college, and right before she went to work for the presidential campaign. And on that campaign, she had met Carol Erickson. Carol was in the Congressman Miller's office at this point. And so Carol and she had talked for many years about, how if Brad needed help, he should hire Jamie because she was great, Carol knew her, et cetera. Around, I guess it was November, December, Congressman Miller's current consultant said they were leaving, not going to work with him any longer. They wanted to transition their business in a variety of ways, and they were also working with Treasurer Cowell, who's Janet Cowell, who's a statewide candidate, so it's a little more work typically. And so they suggested that Sky Blue go after Congressman Miller. They recommended them, and they ultimately would go through an interview process, led by Jamie, but with him, with the defendant being present. over the course of, I guess they started having the conversation in December, but the pitch meetings or the meetings to try to earn the job was mid-January, early February, I believe.
Once they acquire the new client, Representative Miller, tell us a little bit about the division of labor of Sky Blue between Jamie and the defendant from Broyhill and what they're responsible for as to this particular client.
She was heavily focused on the fundraising portion, so the actual raising of the funds. So that would generally mean that she would help staff's call time. So that's when the congressman would call donors and ask them to donate to the campaign. She would help organize the actual fundraising events, because a lot of times the way you raise the money is through, like, you have a house party, like someone opens up their house and they invite their friends and the people donate when they're there. So she would manage the events heavily. And then she would help on sort of higher level strategy if there was any. At that point, they were primarily focused on fundraising because there was redistricting process ongoing, and so they weren't sure what the district would look like. The districts are redrawn every 10 years. At the time, they were assuming that Congressman Miller's district would become infinitely more weighted towards Republicans because Republicans were drawing the lines, and that's the way it tends to work. But the expectation was he was going to run for re-election. It would just be a more difficult campaign. So they were really heavily focused on fundraising. The defendant would help on, I know, compliance, which is the filing of reports to the FEC. And those would be like incoming donations, outgoing receipts. He was responsible for cutting the checks, checking the mail. He also staffed Congressman Miller a fair amount, so he would drive the congressman to events. Because the way it works is you have a congressional office, you have a political office. The congressional staff, when they're on the government dime, can't take the congressman to a political event. So they have to be paid by the campaign, or they have to do it on a volunteer basis. So usually what happens is political staff or consultants take the congressman around. And so he would do a lot of the driving of Congressman Miller to different events and so on and so forth.
You mentioned checking the mail. Checking the mail where?
Wherever the campaign received mail.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it wasn't at our home. It was at an office or at a P.O. box or something.
Sky Blue is operated out of your residence.
Yeah, she had a home office really throughout, so both in our apartment in Cary, and then when we moved to Tillwood, she worked out of our home.
When did you move to the Tillwood Place residence?
This was spring of 2011, so we moved early May or late May. It was sometime in May of 2011.
Okay, 2011, raising funds, expectation of a congressional race in November 2012 with Mr. Miller.
Yes.
Let's go to early 2012.
Okay.
Does that change?
At some point, the congressman decided he wasn't going to run for re-election. Subsequent to that, Governor Bev Perdue announced she wasn't going to run for re-election. So Congressman Miller briefly explored the concept of running for governor. He had been redistricted into a district with Congressman David Price, so it would have pitted two incumbent congressmen against one another, and Price had more money in the bank and was also more senior. So, let's see, Congressman Miller considered the governor's race for maybe 10 days in February, and the filing deadline was end of February. He ultimately decided not to run. So at that point, the federal campaign would have been on hold anyways. They were. I know Jamie was checking with the FEC to see if federal funds could be transferred into a state level race, et cetera. But the federal campaign was absolutely on hold. And while he considered the gubernatorial race, and then he ultimately decided not to run. And at that point, the campaign was completely on hold. He would still do political events. So they would still, either Jamie or the defendant would take Congressman Miller to a political event. Or they would, he would still, want to make political calls. He was trying to retain, sort of remain a part of the community and sort of keep his options open for subsequent runs for office, should he so choose.
So as to Sky Blue's responsibilities post-announcement of not seeking office in November 2012, at the beginning of 2012, what does Jamie and the defendant, Mr. Broyhill, and Sky Blue, tell us about that, please?
They were really busy that spring. They had a number of clients. One client who was running for governor in the primary. They had a constitutional amendment campaign that they were working on, Sky Blue was working on. They had a couple of legislators had hired them to do like one-off events or maybe even help with the campaign. They had the nonprofit she had throughout. Anyways, they were very, very busy that spring. And so they were constantly sort of flying by the seat of their pants, working on a multitude of campaigns. That was probably the busiest they ever were, or Sky Blue ever was.
And as we get to, at the end of 2012, what is the relationship, business relationship between Sky Blue and Jonathan Broyhill? Tell us about that.
So he had gotten sick, or he had, I guess in August. It was August, I believe. We were told he came home and told us he'd been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. The defendant, John, and he was sick. He was going to doctor's appointments semi-frequently. He would, we didn't see him as often on the weekends, and he would occasionally have to take a break from work to, deal with what he's described as sort of blinding headaches. But even still, they were still working together. They had to work with the congressman on the Democratic National Convention, which was in Charlotte. And so Congressman Miller, as in-state congressman, received an allotment of tickets. So, for example, they had to work with his office to determine who would receive those tickets. She would primarily be the one who was working on with Research Triangle Park, so that foundation, on a statewide bus tour. He helped on a couple of legislative candidates. So they were sort of divvied up into their own clients. I mean, he was helping to continue to pay Congressman Miller's bills, or the campaign's bills, and dealing with compliance. And she would occasionally help Congressman Miller as needed. And around that time was when, I guess it was late fall, he started doing call time again because he was going to raise funds, because he was trying to raise funds to repay his debt to the campaign. So Jamie and the defendant would both split their time with Congressman Miller during that time period. So anyways, they still had an array of clients, but they were sort of one-off. Some were, Jamie was dealing with Research Triangle Park. He was dealing with a legislative candidate, for example. And so that continued through the fall.
If you know, did Sky Blue's compensation as to Representative Miller change at some point in 2012, 2013?
It did. It declined. Sometime that summer, it declined from their standard monthly rate to a lower monthly rate. I think that it was about a third as much, maybe, or half as much, for several months. And so that was to reflect the decline in responsibilities.
Who would pay Jonathan Broyhill at first? Would Representative Miller, or would Jamie through Sky Blue pay Jonathan?
The Miller campaign committee would pay Sky Blue. Sky Blue would take the money into their business account, and Jamie had a payroll set up to pay the defendant, and so she ran his payroll every 2 weeks, and so that was her responsibility. I think it was every 2 weeks. It was her responsibility.
Let's talk about Jonathan Broyhill's medical issue or issues. You mentioned the MS. When did he tell you he was suffering from MS, roughly?
Spring of 2012, he started complaining of not feeling right, of being sluggish, of having headaches, of nausea, and so he said, but after this busy time period, I'll go to the doctor. And he started going to have doctor's appointments in June and July. I think it was August, if I remember correctly. I just remember Jamie called me, and I was at a meeting, and she said, come home right after work. We need to talk. John wants to talk to you, and we need to talk. And I was like, well, what's going on? And she said, no, he wants to tell you. He wants to tell you. I was concerned because he'd been complaining about health issues. And so if I remember correctly, I asked her to put him on the phone. And when I was on the phone, he told me that he had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, or MS. That, the prognosis was pretty good. I mean, it's a debilitating disease, but it's a very slow moving illness. We also knew a lady, Pam Cole, who was very high-powered position. She ran Congressman Miller's office, and she had MS. And so we had known her for several years, and she was able to function and work. And so I remember coming home that night and just having further discussions with the defendant about it. And we were, Jamie in particular was, anything we can do, we'll do. And she, as was her wont, dove right into research, trying to figure out, okay, well, how do you contain this? And so she and I both, but primarily she, would research diets that there's a strand of thought that like a diet heavy on kale and certain nutrients helps like slow or mitigate the effects of MS, for example. And so Jamie started cooking more kale at home. But anyways, throughout the fall, he would have doctor's appointments.
Tell us a little bit about, once he told you he had MS, kind of let us know from that point forward the interactions you would have with them, and is this just a one-off statement and then every 4 months he would bring it up, or is this day for day in your interactions with him, you and Jamie, with Jonathan Broyhill, and this issue of MS?
Yeah, no, sir. I mean, it was a pretty frequent topic of discussion. He told us that, and I guess this is the way it works, is that you have injections that of medicine that sort of help mitigate the effects. And certainly I knew that Pam Cole had those. And so he would meet with Pam periodically, and what he told us is he was going to emulate her way of treating it, which is you do the shots on Saturday, and that gets you, and because it has an after effect, it like sort of knocks you out, gives you like flu-like symptoms or something to that effect for about 24 hours. And so he would take the shot on Saturday, or give the shot to himself on Saturday, on Sunday. That way he could feel bad on Sunday and be back to work on Monday. So we didn't see him nearly as frequently on the weekends, particularly on Saturday nights or on Sundays, because of the shots that he was giving himself. MS makes you, our understanding was, makes you slower moving in the morning. So he started coming in a little bit later. I mean, Jamie usually had told him to try to be there between around 9:30 or maybe 10, and he started coming in a little bit later periodically. I can remember a couple of days where he would complain of sort of blinding headaches or other symptoms that were, that were part of MS. And that, like, I came home one day and he was laying upstairs with a wet washcloth over his head, over his face. We encouraged him, particularly Jamie encouraged him to go on walks to try to. Our understanding was the way that MS works is it attacks your muscles over time and helps break down muscles over time. And so Jamie encouraged him to go on long walks or to do anything really physical that would help him preserve his muscle mass or his health for as long as possible. So it was an ongoing topic, absolutely. He would occasionally have appointments. I think his doctor was in Chapel Hill.
Why do you think that?
He told us it was in Chapel Hill. Okay. Sorry. And so he would need an afternoon off, or he'd need to come in late to go to his doctor's appointment in Chapel Hill. He typically went alone, or I think always went alone. But he would say, he would fill us in as he left. I know at various points he was concerned that there were lesions on his brain, which I think is a common occurrence from MS, and those lesions were growing, like there were more of them. And so he would share, either they stayed the same, they shrunk, they grew. At some point, I believe it was still in 2012 when this happened, his doctors advised him that he switched to an infusion treatment. Stop the injections, which were sort of self-done, and switch to infusions, which is where you go to the hospital and you're there for, I think, 3 hours roughly. We always offered, either one of us, primarily Jamie, offered to take him to those appointments, but our friend Carol Erickson, who had worked for Congressman Miller, was out of a job come November, and so she was the one who would ultimately take him. So we would always talk to Carol. She'd fill us in. She would take him up, drop him off. He would deal with infusions for a couple of hours, and she would go pick him up, take him home, and usually have cooked him a meal that she would leave with him and that sort of thing. And I think that was, so I guess if Carol was doing it, that must have been December, January, February December of 2012, January, February 2013 when he switched treatments.
Carol Erickson, Pam
Cole.
To your knowledge, is that someone the defendant deceived about having MS?
Yes. Pam had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis several years prior, and she was the congressman's district director, so she was on the congressional staff. But she had a lot of dealings with Jamie and with the defendant, because she would call and say, hey, this organization wants Congressman Miller to come speak, so will you go staff him? So we had all gotten to know each other fairly well. Once he was diagnosed with, or once he told us he was diagnosed with MS, he would go have coffee with Pam semi-regularly, and she would give him tips on how to combat MS. She gave him resources, connected him to the MS Society, recommended support groups. And so she was really a resource for him during this time period where he told us he had MS. And Carol, like I said, would ultimately be the person who would take him to appointments once his treatment switched to infusions.
You and Jamie and John Broyhill had a large group of friends.
We did, absolutely.
So this is not a diagnosis just known to you and Jamie. Is that all these friends are all aware of the defense MS?
Yeah, I mean, at one point, our friend who was in PA school would even offer to help deliver the shots for him. And it was certainly a diagnosis that was widely known within our group of friends, within the community.
Never doubted?
No, sir. Why
How
would you?
What other memory issues, physical manifestations of this MS as he's announcing he has it and as y'all's friendship?
As MS proceeds, it like I said, I think it attacks muscle. So like Pam, for example, has difficulty walking up hills and walking down hills. She's so the defendant started complaining about walking long distances and would occasionally be hobbled himself. He started taking more copious notes, and he would complain about, I remember one time him being, I can't remember what he had forgotten. He's like, damn it, I forgot this, and he would get very frustrated with himself about memory loss issues that he blamed on the multiple sclerosis, or at least believed was a symptom of the MS. It was pretty widely known because even, when he started looking for other work, other employment, one of the organizations he was looking for, the executive director was a very good friend of all of ours. And he, John, was concerned that this executive director would hold his MS against him as he proceeded with the job search. And so that was a very active and very ongoing discussion. Every one of us watched The West Wing. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the president on The West Wing had MS as well. And I remember as we tried to prep him for his job interview, or as Jamie tried to prep him for his job interview, his line that he was going to use if they asked about the MS was, if Josiah Bartlett can be president of the United States and have multiple sclerosis, I can do this job. So I mean, it was definitely a wide discussion among our friends.
Gallstone issues.
Let's see. Spring. I think the first time that he started complaining of gallstone issues was spring of 2012.
This predates the MS.
It predated the MS. He started having some gallstone issues. He went into the doctor, and the doctor basically advised him to change his diet, is what he had told us. So he began to somewhat eat healthier.
And this is what he's told you.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Did the gallstone issues at some point alleviate? Did he stop talking about gallstone issues?
I guess we certainly didn't hear much about them for a period of time. In 2013, I guess it was late February, early March, must have been early March, we, a group of us had gone to Atlanta, so 4 friends, and we'd met other friends in Atlanta. And while we were there, we went to the Varsity and had chili dogs and didn't eat healthy at all. When we came back, he complained of a gallstone attack or of an issue. He would ultimately go to the doctor, and they would say they need to have his gall, whatever the surgery is to remove gallstones.
So this is in 2013. Before we pick up with maybe March 2013, how about on a day-to-day basis in 2000, let's let's start with 2011, when he starts working for, when Congressman Miller is a client of Sky Blue, 2011. Jonathan Broyhill is working for Jamie at Sky Blue. What is the defense? Is he happy? Is he morose? What's his attitude throughout 2011 and 12? Any complaints he's telling you about? Or?
No, I mean, he seemed happy for the most part. You know, he really enjoyed the Jane Dyer campaign because they both had worked really hard, and I think he felt like a real sense of accomplishment. And they both really, that winter, I mean, this is familiar to anyone that worked on a campaign. You work 20 hours a day, you know, or whatever, and you're in the midst of a campaign that feels like it's the most important thing in the world, and the campaign's over, and it's just sort of like, you know, you just have a letdown. And so they both had a letdown that winter, where they were looking for new clients, and so during that time period, neither one of them was particularly, you know, they weren't as bubbly as they normally were. But once they got Congressman Miller, I think they both were happier. I mean, certainly he was back to work with Jamie, and they would gradually increase their business.
Jumping towards the MS diagnosis, the latter part of 2012, I mean, other than what types of complaints, there's MS he's dealing with, which is what he's telling you, but how else is his demeanor and attitude throughout your friendship?
I mean, I think, you know, with us both, he would, particularly with Jamie, he would complain about, oh, you know, I'm never going to find anyone that I'm with for, you know, I just want a partner. I want someone that I'm with for a long time. A relationship, yes. You know, but I mean, it was just standard friend stuff. You know, it was, you know, this date didn't go well or this date did go well. You know, I'll never find anyone that, you know, I'm with for a long period of time. And, you know, just standard stuff. I mean, nothing unusual. No, sir. No, sir. I mean, he would, you know, they both, like, okay, spring of 2012, again, they're really, really busy. They get to the end of that time. They take a deep breath. And for, you know, a couple of weeks, they both had another letdown because they'd had multiple clients. Those clients had lost or the clients had come to an end. So, again, it was one of those boom and bust periods where your adrenaline wears off and you're just collapse and exhaustion. And so during that period of time, they were both down again. I mean, Jamie was certainly evaluating what she wanted to do with her business moving forward, you know, and he, at that point, began to have some health issues or was certainly beginning to complain about headaches and so on and so forth. So, I mean, there were periods of time where they both were unhappy at work, or he was unhappy with, or they were unhappy with, you know, not having enough clients, or, you know, you work really hard and then you get to a period of time where you're like, okay, what do I do now? So he would complain about, you know, being down during that time period, but so would Jamie because, again, they were working hard and then they weren't, or whatever.
From your point of view, nothing more than the normal ups and downs of life?
No, I mean, he always used to make a joke that when he was eating particularly bad, and I think it's from a movie, that, you know, the sooner my body gives out, the better. But he would laugh about it and everybody would be like, oh, God, you know, there you go again. But nothing ever direct, like, oh, my, you know, I want to jump off this building or anything.
At the beginning of 2013, let me direct you to Jonathan Broyhill no longer is working for Sky Blue officially, right? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Let's talk about Representative Miller, Jamie, what is her responsibility as to Representative Miller, and Jonathan Broyhill's involvement or lack thereof in that process as we start in the first few months of 2013.
So their final task in 2012 was a thank you party for the staff, for Congressman Miller's staff. And again, they were winding down the campaign accounts and filing the FEC reports. And so that extended. The Miller campaign had changed the arrangement beginning, I think, at December 1 or January 1, where they were going to pay them on a quarterly, pay Sky Blue, on a quarterly basis, a very minor amount, really to just make sure they could keep up with the books, you know, if the congressman needed something political, if a vendor, you know, needed a payment, et cetera. And as long as there was money in the FEC accounts, or the federal accounts, there had to be FEC reports filed. So there would continue to be FEC reports filed every 3 months for as long as there was money in the account. And so that was they were transitioning into that role. I mean, he and Jamie, John and Jamie, had a discussion in November or December about their future working relationship. And John had said, that with the multiple sclerosis and with his health problems, he wanted a less stressful job than being in a political campaign. He wanted, a nonprofit or a 9 to 5. And at the same time, Jamie also knew that her revenue was going to decline, so she couldn't afford to keep paying him as an employee. So they had a discussion, the two of them, I wasn't present, about that, and so she started helping him look for a job. At the same time, they were trying to wind down the Miller stuff, the primary responsibilities.
Where was Jonathan Broyhill living, if you know, in 2013, beginning of 2013?
He had lived in the Bacana apartments on Glenwood. He then moved to a residence on Glasscock, down like sort of way past the Oakwood Dog Park, if you're familiar. He had hired movers to help him move, and I'm trying to remember when it was, but I think it was like summer of 2012. He had moved in there. He had a roommate who he had found. She had just posted online like, "Hey, I'm looking for a roommate."
Donna?
Yes, I believe so.
Did you ever meet?
I
Did you ever
met
go to the house? Did you
Donna.
ever meet Donna?
I met Donna twice. Once when we didn't really do anything to help him move in because he hired movers. But when he was moving in, we met Donna, and then maybe once or I guess just once more that I can remember when we'd stop in and pick him up. If we were going somewhere, we would see Donna there.
And Jonathan Broyhill hired movers to make that move to Glasgow?
He did.
What type of car did he drive? Talk about.
At the time, he was driving a silver Volvo.
Okay. Do you recall going with him when he bought this car?
I did.
Tell us about how this car, about going to buy the car.
His previous car had been, I believe, stolen and wrecked. And this was, I think it was around Jamie's birthday, so it was October of 2011, if I remember correctly. And so for several weeks while he was trying to figure out how he's going to pay for the car, either Jamie or I, one, would loan him our car if he needed to go somewhere, like if he needed to take the congressman to an event. He mostly did the car shopping on his own, but sometimes I would go if I was off work or whatever just to give him advice. So we went to different dealerships. He ultimately found this Volvo. I think he just found it online, but it was on a dealership off Capitol. And so he was going to get financing through the bank and buy the car.
Okay. Did you go to the bank with him?
Yeah, I actually did. I can't remember. Oh, I know what it was. I had to drive him there because he didn't have a car, so he could get his check, and then he could drive his car, his new car, home. And so I drove him over to the Wells Fargo. I guess it was at the time, or it was Wachovia or Wells Fargo. I don't know if it transitioned yet, where he banked. So he was supposed to get a check from the bank and his loan paperwork, and then he was going to go buy his car. So I sat in the parking lot. I was on the phone with a client, if I remember correctly. There was some reason I didn't go in, but I stayed in the car. He came back out after 20 minutes, hopped in the car. We drove down. I dropped him off, and then he was driving the Volvo from that day forward.
And he thought he financed it.
He told us he'd finance it through the bank.
In the last couple years of 2011, 12, 13, any trips you're aware of Ms. Broyhill made to Las Vegas?
He did go to Las Vegas in the fall of 2011, I believe it was.
How many times did he go to Vegas to now?
In 2011, 2012, 2013, just once that I remember. He had been seeing a guy, and they had broken things off. And then he started he told us he was seeing another guy he had met online who was from Maine but came down to North Carolina periodically. And so he told us that he and the person from Maine were going to Las Vegas.
Let's see, let's go to 2013. At some point, was Jamie having to address some Brad Miller and wind down issues and any frustration that she was having in trying to address these issues and the involvement of Jonathan Broyhill or lack thereof. Can you kind of talk to us about that particular issue?
The first frustration I remember, well, there was frustration in August, I think it was, around the eve of the convention. They were, trying to do these calls to, I think it was around that time they started trying to repay the the congressman's loans to the campaign. The power was shut off to the campaign office, and so the bills had been paid late. So she had to step in and get the defendant to straighten that out. So that straightened out. So that was an issue that flared up around the eve of the convention. I remember she was very frustrated by, but it was a quick fix. It was
That's the local campaign office?
yeah, that was over at the Advocates for Justice building. She went from there. So then we had the convention. In December, there was a thank you party, and the checks to the catering company, and there was a company that made these sort of memento glasses, were late going out, so she was frustrated by that. That was still when John should have been writing the checks, and those went out very late. Starting in January, February, March, they were in the midst of, cutting refund checks to donors, and then, they had requested of the donors, or the congressman had requested of the donors, that the donor mail, that if he or she so choose, that they would mail a check to the state campaign, so he could repay his loan there. And I think there were loans both between the federal and the state, if I remember correctly. So they were in the middle of repaying those. I think that
John Blue didn't manage the state campaign account
they did not.
at all.
No, sir.
But that was some part of trying to repay some loans. You just
Yeah, there were. I believe the congressman had made loans both to the federal and the state campaign. I don't remember. I don't know for sure, but I remember that was my understanding. I think.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
So those loans, there were two. I think they totaled close to like high 20s, mid to high 20s, if I remember correctly, 20,000.
These are state campaign loans.
I think it was
What are your
mostly,
understandings?
my understanding was mostly state campaign loans that the congressman had made at one point when he was a state senator and in a heated election. That money was intended to really be paid to him, really to help him as he transitioned into private sector and away from Congress because he was job hunting. And so there were a lot of delays in sort of getting information. Since John was no longer working with her, he wasn't in their office, and so she had to rely on email or text or calls to get a hold of him. I mean, obviously we'd see each other as friends, but if we were going out to dinner with other friends, she wasn't going to sit there and badger him. We also thought he had health issues. So I can't remember the exact chronology, but it was just very slow moving. And so Phyllis Barber, who
Tell us who Phyllis Barber is.
So Pam Cole had left Congressman Miller's staff because she was looking for a full-time job because she knew he wasn't running for re-election, and she'd gone to work for Susan G. Komen. And so Phyllis had been promoted to interim district director. And so Phyllis was the main point of contact with Congressman Miller, particularly once the office shut down. And so Phyllis was playing the role of helping to follow up and saying, hey, the congressman called. He's wondering when are these checks going to be dispersed, or how much money has been mailed in, whatever the questions were.
It was being put to Jamie.
Generally, yeah, because at that point John was on board. Now because she knew that John was in charge of a lot of the compliance issues, a lot of the check writing, checking the mail, etc., she would also direct them to John. And either way, most often she emailed them both.
At some point, was Jamie needing stuff from the defendant, Mr. Broyhill, and was she able to answer these questions? Just tell us how that kind of progresses.
Part of it was that she was trying to figure out the timing of, so when you mail a donor a refund and you're asking the donor in turn to pay off, to write a check to pay off a debt, I mean, the donor's under no obligation to do that. So she was trying to figure out, okay, as this money was slow and moving, is it because the donors are taking their time writing a check? Is it because the donor decided he or she didn't want to mail in a check? And so she was trying to piece together when the money was coming in, how had it gone out, and trying to figure out like sort of a payment schedule, so to speak, for for Congressman Miller, and I think they paid the campaign, they being the campaign, I think it was the state campaign. There was a check of around, I don't know, there was a check at one point that was paid. That was maybe half or less than half of the amount that Congressman Miller was owed.
All right, let me, without getting into, you understand, details of checks and amounts. At some point, is Jamie, if you know, asking the defendant for help?
She is, yes, sir.
Just generally take us through that progression in the beginning of 2013.
Well, because he had handled compliance throughout, I mean, she was always aware of the money that was coming in. She had access to NGP, which was the campaign software, so she would see this money came in, this is our cash on hand figure, et cetera. It wasn't in real time. It relied on like people entering stuff in, primarily the defendant. So while she kept abreast of the money, she was primarily concerned about the money coming in, and then making sure there were and helping with the filing of the reports, which John primarily did. But he checked the mail for the campaign. He had the mail key. I don't know if they both did or not, but regardless, he was responsible for checking the mail, and he would bring her whatever mail had arrived. And then he was also the check writer for the campaign primarily. So he would go to the office, and I think they had something that would cut the check. So like he would go in and print the checks off. So he had the bank books, like the actual physical copies of the bank books, et cetera. So she needed all of that different information to begin to piece together. Here's how much money, here's where we are with the repayment. And she also was taking over the responsibility for doing the quarterly reports, beginning with that first quarter. So she also needed that information.
So let's direct your attention to, as we get near the end of March,
Okay.
and the defendant's gallstone issues. Tell us about the progression of the complaints as to gallstone issues as we are now into March.
So when all of us got back from Atlanta, he started complaining about more and more health issues. And so, issues with what he presumed were gallstones, nausea, throwing up, going to the restroom a lot, etc. At some point, he went into the doctor in that mid-March, into March period, and they told him that he would need to have his gallstones removed, for whatever the procedure is. So he scheduled the surgery. It was scheduled for, I think, maybe the last week of March, if I remember correctly. And I remember it was scheduled later in the week because Jamie, because she had fewer clients at that point, she had 2 nonprofits she was working with, offered to take him to the surgery. And so that would have been I think it was on a Thursday. So she had blocked off the whole day. On Wednesday, I think it was, he contacted her and said, so sorry, I'm not going to, my blood pressure was too high. I went in for pre-op appointment, and they said my blood pressure was too high. I'm really embarrassed that my blood pressure is too high, but they said it wouldn't be safe for me to have surgery. So he said, they've given me some medication to deal with that, and they pushed my surgery back to the week following.
Right. What date was the surgery pushed back to?
I believe it was pushed back to the following Tuesday.
The beginning of April?
It was the beginning of April, yes.
Yes.
What's marked as States Exhibit 112. Do you recognize what States Exhibit 112 depicts?
I do.
Okay, what generally is it?
It's the month of April in 2013.
And some of the dates, there's various language in here. You've been shown States Exhibit 112 before your testimony today, have you not?
I have, sir.
All right. Would States Exhibit 112 help you illustrate, as you discussed, day for day, the month of April 2013, and your knowledge and interaction with the defendant, Jonathan Broyhill?
It would, sir.
All right. This time, the state, for illustrative purposes only, would enter States Exhibit 112 into evidence.
And it's allowed for illustrative purposes. Yes, sir.
As Mr. Hahn testifies.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
jurors on the far left here, my left, see the screen well enough? All right, very good.
All right, so April, gallbladder surgery, high blood pressure, it's now pushed back to the beginning of April.
Yes, it was pushed back to Tuesday the 2nd.
Where is Jonathan Broyhill? Is he now employed?
He had taken a job, or at least he had told us he had taken a job with LabCorp as a sort of a lab assistant or admin assistant.
What do you tell us everything he told you about his lab court job, application, trying to get the job and getting it?
He was job hunting with various nonprofits, primarily the MS Society, Multiple Sclerosis Society being one here in Raleigh, and then there were a few others. In I think it was mid-February, he came to us and said, I've been applying for jobs. I've gotten a job offer from LabCorp. I'm not very excited about it, but it pays decently well, but I don't know if I'm going to take it, because my heart's really set on sort of staying in the nonprofit space or doing something different from that. He ultimately would choose to take that job, or at least he told us he did. And so he was working for LabCorp at that point,
And where was he?
or at least that was our understanding.
The MS Society meetings he had trying to get a job. You were aware of that?
I know that he had submitted his resume with, I believe, because I'd worked with her before, Shannon Henson at the MS Society, because Pam Cole and myself had both put in a good word that that she should consider hiring him.
You have personal knowledge of the MS Society.
I do, yes, sir.
Application trying to get a job. LabCorp, he tells you about LabCorp. Tell us about where he was going to work and what he was supposed to be doing and his schedule, that sort of thing.
So I know, I believe he said that there was an office or a lab in North Raleigh. There's also a LabCorp office on the way to Durham if you're in RTP. And at least 3 different times we'd drive by there and I'd say, "Oh, Jamie, that's where John works." And she would at first gently chide me and then later be like, "God, quit being an idiot. I've told you 3 times he works in North Raleigh." He was also supposed to, or at least he told us he was going to Burlington 2 times a week, I think, I guess to run materials back and forth.
Tuesday, April 2nd. Tell us everything you recall and know about Tuesday, April 2nd.
Well, when his surgery was pushed back, he had asked if I think his roommate Donna was out of the country at the time. So he had asked Jamie if he could stay with us during his recovery period. And Jamie had said, yes, of course, no problem. And, again, it was supposed to happen on Thursday. When it was pushed back, a small issue arose because Jamie's mother was coming to visit her. She's a teacher. It was over her spring break. And so we had one guest bed, and then we had a futon. And so, Jamie didn't want either one of them to feel like she wanted her mother to feel like she could come and visit her and that she wasn't imposing or getting in the way. And she wanted John to feel like, yeah, of course, we're there for you during your recovery. So anyway, she gently massaged it, and Deborah ended up coming up and was going to sleep on the futon during that during the days of recovery so that he could have the bed during that period. So I was at work that Tuesday, and Jamie had offered to take the defendant, and he had said no, that his parents would. I believe he said his father and his stepmother would. So can't to the surgery. I'm sorry, sir. And so the understanding was they were going to drop him off at our house afterwards, his dad and stepmom, or whomever, so that he could he could rest up. So I would text Jamie periodically saying, hey, have you heard anything from his surgery? Have you heard anything from your mom? If I remember correctly, her mom got up there first for lunch before he had gotten out of the surgery.
Jamie's mother?
Jamie's mother, Deborah. Yes, sir.
Had gotten to your
Had arrived in Raleigh. Yes, sir. And at some point, Ken Broyhill, the defendant's father, had texted Jamie from John's phone saying, hey, it's Ken. He's out of the surgery fine. I know this because she said, hey, John's parents texted me, or and told me. Anyways, so, but he told us he gotten sick on his way out of the surgery, and so he needed to go home to change. So Jamie would relate to me that she and Deborah would go pick him up at his home on Glasscock, instead of his parents dropping him off.
No one dropped Jonathan Broyhill off at your house that Tuesday, April 2nd.
No, sir.
All right.
Not to my knowledge.
Do you see Jonathan Broyhill sometime Tuesday, April the 2nd?
I did. I had a meeting in Greenville, North Carolina that evening. I think it was Greenville. And so I was gone until late. On the way back from Greenville, Jamie texted me and said that, it was getting later, that the defendant wanted Jell-O. And she asked, would you stop by the store, pick up some Jell-O for him? We don't have any at the house. He wants to eat something, but can't have much on his stomach. It was probably 10:30-ish or so when I was getting back, because that's about what time I would normally get back when I was in Greenville. So I stopped by the store, got Jell-O, came home, and I walked upstairs. Jamie and Deborah were both asleep, or at least in their respective bedrooms. So I gave him Jell-O. He was propped up in bed.
Tell us about, this is the first time you see him after his surgery?
Yes,
What's he looking like? What is he saying?
I mean, he said that he'd gone through the surgery okay. He looked fatigued, but it was, close to 11. He moved really gingerly, and I guess indicated where they had an incision. And so he sort of moved gingerly, propped himself up. He was on his iPad when I came in. We just generally had a conversation. He said, yeah, I've been fine. I feel okay, weak, nauseous. But everything went well. And we just had a pretty simple conversation.
Did you see his wounds? Did he have any bandages?
I did not. He had prescription drugs on his nightstand, and I think, if I remember correctly, a CVS bag. He may have had Band-Aids or something on his arm, as if somebody had given you an IV, but I didn't ask to see his incision.
So that's Tuesday night. Is that kind of the end of your action after
Yes,
the
sir.
surgery with Jonathan Broyhill? And Jamie's mother was sleeping where?
On the futon in the cat room, as we called it,
Why do you call it the cat room?
because that's where the litter box was.
Wednesday, April 3rd.
Yes, sir.
Tell us about the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, those dates. Where was Jonathan Broyhill?
He stayed upstairs in our guest bedroom, sort of for the duration, for most of that week. I want to say Thursday night was the first time he came downstairs, and he walked really gingerly, and he came downstairs and he visited with us for a little bit. But generally he was in his room for the most part. Friday, my parents had come into town, and so I'd taken the afternoon off work, and so Jamie and I went and visited with them in Durham. We went to Duke Gardens and surrounding area, and he called us and asked us if we'd bring food, and so that was the first time that he really was downstairs for a lengthy period of time during that week. He was downstairs when we came home, because he said that the stairs were difficult, and during that time period, so we came home, brought him food. The next day, he was finally feeling up to going home, and so.
Are you going to work at least on Wednesday, Thursday? I think you said you took some time off Friday for your parents.
Yeah, I was at work during that time period.
If you know Jamie or Jamie's mother, waiting on the defendant hand and foot, so to speak?
They would, either prepare him food or go get him food, take him water, take him Jell-O, take him whatever he needed, when he was laying in the bedroom recovering.
So Saturday, was he going?
Yeah, Saturday, Jamie and I decided we were going to go out downtown and have dinner, and so, Jamie asked him, do you want to come with us? You haven't been out of the house, might do you some good. So we went out to dinner, fairly early dinner, and then we would drop him off at his house on Glasscock.
When's the next time do you see Jonathan Broyhill?
I don't think I saw him that Sunday. A lot of times we would have, particularly as we'd gotten busier, we'd spent less time together. And so He and Jamie really love Dancing with the Stars and The Bachelorette, some of those like crap reality shows. No offense to anyone who likes them. If you like them, I'll say good reality shows. Reality shows on Monday nights, and so they would have. So a lot of times Jamie would prepare dinner. The three of us would eat dinner. They would watch the reality show, and I would not. And so I think he was supposed to come over that night for dinner, but because he'd had the time off the week before, if I remember correctly, he told us he had to work late at LabCorp.
Okay. Do you recall on Monday the 8th about Dancing with the Stars, but also Jamie's request or need for
The campaign finance report was coming up. I'm sorry, Doug. Campaign finance report was coming up. It's on the 15th so it's a quarterly report. March 31st would have been the end, so that you have to file it by the 15th. So there's a deadline looming. So Jamie wanted to work on that. She also wanted to, get any paperwork that he had that she didn't have, the keys, etc. He was supposed to come over and help her with that while we ate dinner and they watched the reality show.
And did he come over that night?
He did not, no sir,
And did he give you a reason why
because he had to work late at LabCorp.
at LabCorp?
I believe so, yes sir.
Tuesday, April the 9th. Tell us about everything you recall as to Tuesday, April the 9th.
We were going to do dinner at home that night. Jamie had asked him if he wanted to stay. They were also going to work through the quarterly report. And so I drove home. Jamie had a meeting, I think, downtown. And so I came home early, and there was no one there. I pulled in. I was on the phone with a former colleague, and I saw the defendant pull up, or John pull up, through the window. And he walked in, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. He looked very weak, sort of white-faced. And as he walked towards me, I sort of mouthed, "What's wrong?" And he broke down in tears and sort of collapsed against my chest crying. So I hung up the phone, and I led him into the living room, and I was asking him what was wrong, and he was crying. Finally, he calmed down. He sat down on the couch, and I asked him, what's wrong? And he said, well, I went for my post-op visit with the doctor today, and he sort of choked up. He said, that they found a spot when they were going in to remove my gallstones or whatever it was with the surgery, and they wanted to biopsy that spot. He said, and he said, the doctor was in disbelief that the nurse hadn't told me to bring anyone with me. The defendant told me that. And then he started crying again, and he said, it's because they think I have pancreatic cancer. And I was stunned. I tried to comfort him as best I could. I don't even remember the conversation except that we were obviously trying to comfort him. I called Jamie and I said, Jamie, hurry home. There's something that John needs to tell you. He wants to tell you in person. And she was obviously thrown off by that. She said, okay. And she texted me, what's wrong? She told me I think I was supposed to turn rice on the stove or something. I'm not a cook remotely. So it was, whatever it was difficult for me to do. And she asked me to start, get a few things ready for dinner. And then she came home, and he told her also.
How was that event? I mean, now it's you, your wife, and the defendant there at your house, and he's telling you about possible pancreatic cancer. Is everyone crying?
Certainly Jamie and I were upset. Pancreatic cancer is considered a killer, right? It's considered like a death sentence. And so we tried to reassure him, but I think we were both sort of just stunned. We ended up eating. He told us he had been driving around aimlessly, just sort of in disbelief, that he had tried to reach Nancy Petty, our minister.
Okay, Nancy Petty.
She's the minister at Pullen Memorial on Hillsborough Street.
Okay, and who attends that church?
All three of us would attend with some regularity. Yes, sir.
Go ahead, I'm sorry. So he told you that
He had tried to call Nancy. He had been driving around disbelief. So we had these conversations. We ate dinner, and I stepped outside to call Nancy to see if I could get a hold of her. And I got a hold of her, and I said, I really think you need to talk to John. He's going through a hard time. So I put her on the phone with him. They had a conversation. But yeah, it was a very trying night. I mean, this was a real blow, just to know that someone that was such a good friend was facing something so serious.
no FEC report work was done that.
No. I mean, Jamie was really torn up, as was I, and so they didn't. She and I went to bed.
Did the defendant stay the night with you guys that night?
He had Nancy had agreed to see him first thing in the morning. She offered to come over that night, but she agreed to see him first thing in the morning to talk to him, counsel him. So he stayed the night. Jamie and I went upstairs, and that was actually the first time I saw Jamie cry about everything.
Upstairs?
Yeah, we were in our bedroom.
Tell us about it, please.
She had been very calm throughout. I mean, she was upset, but she was calm. And I came upstairs. She was in the bathroom. We had our master bedroom, and there was a bathroom off of that. And she came out, and I was reading something, and she lay down in the bed beside me, and she started sobbing. And so I put my book down and turned to hug her, and she was very, very upset.
And she was upset
Because someone that we considered so close to us was facing what seemed like a death sentence, and she was really. I think it just drove home to her how fragile life can be. I mean, because it seemed like a death sentence for him. I mean, even if we were optimistic, and I remember. I remember through her tears, she turned to me and said, "Don't you think we should have a baby?" It was really the first time she ever brought it up so distinctly, and I just remember her saying, I want our child to know all the people that we love, and this just, basically that this drives home that the people we love may not always be with us. I'll always remember that conversation. She was very upset. I mean, I was as well, but I was trying to comfort her.
The next day, let's see, on Wednesday, 10th.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about anything you recall in as much detail as you can about Wednesday the 10th.
I don't believe I saw the defendant that day. I know that Jamie had a meeting, that she was working for a nonprofit that was housed at the church. And so she was going to drive to the church anyway, so she had offered to drive him there so he could meet with Nancy at the same time she had her meeting, because she wanted to be with him because he seemed very emotional and sort of fragile after this presumed diagnosis. And so they went to the church. I know they went to the church. We may have met for lunch that day, but I don't remember really seeing him that day. But the expectation was on Thursday we were supposed to take him to Duke Cancer Hospital for like an actual, yes, you have cancer, no, you do not kind of appointment.
Let's talk about Thursday, the 11th. Tell us about everything you recall as to that day, and what was supposed to occur and what did occur.
Jamie had blocked off the day. I think they were going to try to do just tie up some loose ends for the FEC report as well, but we were supposed to take him to Duke. I think we were supposed to be there, Duke Cancer, at maybe 2:00. So I worked through the mid-morning, but I told Jamie, yes, I'll come with you, and I'll come with him. So I came home. He wasn't there. He was supposed to meet us at our house, and then we were going to drive him over there. And as time passed, he didn't show up. We called him. He didn't show up. He didn't pick up, rather. Finally, it was close to time. Jamie was just very concerned that something had happened to him. He'd been in a car wreck, or maybe he was just freaking out about going to the Duke Cancer. So she said, can we drive? So we got in the car and we drove down the way that you would normally take from his house to our house. Didn't see his car. Drove down Glasscock, and when we got close, we saw that his car was parked in the driveway.
What y'all do?
We got out, we knocked on the door.
Okay, tell us about that.
He came to the door and just sort of in a daze. He said, and either Jamie or I, one said, your appointment's like imminent, like, we need to go. And he just, I remember him saying like, oh my God, I can't believe I overslept. I hadn't slept in days. And we said, well, go call the doctor, see if they can fit you in this afternoon. And he walked back into the back of his house, and he was on the phone calling Dude Cancer, or what we presumed. While we sort of just sat in the living room, he came out. We heard him talking on the phone. We did, yes, sir. He came out and he said, hey guys, they've rescheduled it. They think they can fit me in the morning, but I can't go today. A group of us, like, I don't know, maybe 5-10 friends, had bought tickets on Groupon for the Durham Bulls game that night. And so what we said was, why don't you come on? Let's try to get our minds off of this. Let's go to the Durham Bulls game. But it was a couple hours beforehand. So Jamie said, well, why don't you bring your computer and your paperwork, and we can work through like the rest of this report, since I'm meeting with John Wallace tomorrow.
Your wife had a meeting with John Wallace set for when?
It was set for that Friday morning.
Friday morning. And the report was due when?
It would have been due the 15th, that Monday.
Did y'all have vacation plans?
We did. Our 4th anniversary was coming up on April 18th, and my birthday, we got married on, my birthday was the next day, and so I turned 23 on the night of our wedding. So my birthday and our anniversary were always smushed together. And so we decided we were going to go to the beach for our anniversary. We're going to go for, I think, 4 days by ourselves to celebrate our anniversary, and then we were going to invite friends down for our birthday, starting either Thursday or Friday. So we were planning to leave that Sunday, the 14th, and stay through the 21st.
Okay, so you're at the defendant's house on Glasscock. He's rescheduled his missed doctor's appointment Thursday till the next morning.
Correct. Yes, sir.
Jamie has John Wallace meeting the next morning, and she's asking, why don't you come back to our house with your computer and we'll do this FEC report.
Yes, sir. He was sort of shaken up after he'd missed the appointment, so I offered to drive his car up to the house with him riding along, because Jamie and I had driven together. So we drove home. He got in. I went upstairs to do something, and they were supposed to work on the report. But then he had forgotten his computer, he said, at LabCorp. And so he needed the computer for the report. So he said, okay, well, I'll just run over to the office real quick. I'll be right back. Then we can do the report.
Did you see him say that he didn't have his computer, or how this occurred? I mean, how long were y'all at your house?
I can't remember if I was still downstairs or if Jamie just related it. Either way, it was, I believe I was downstairs or walking up the stairs and I heard him say it.
Okay. Was it, had y'all been there a while, or is it right when you got
We had just gotten there. He had just started to unpack when he said that he didn't have his computer.
So the defendant leaves your house?
He does.
Approximately what time of day, or morning or day, are we talking about now?
It was late afternoon. I mean, it was probably, let's see, his appointment was supposed to be either at 2 or at 3. We'd missed the appointment. So it was probably anywhere from 3:30, 4:30, somewhere in there, if I remember correctly.
What's the next thing that happens?
He doesn't show up. He didn't show up. We had friends who were meeting at the game. We had their tickets. The game started at 7. So, I mean, we started texting him, or Jamie started texting him, I believe, to no avail. She called him. I started calling him. I started texting him, no response. It's probably like 20 after 6, something like that. And finally I was like, let's just go to the game. Because, maybe he's going to meet us there. Maybe, either way, he knows we're going to the game. If we're not at the house, we'll be at the game, so maybe he'll come to the game. So we drove to Durham. He wasn't there. We met friends, and we watched the baseball game, and he still didn't show up. At times, we would call. I called various friends or Jamie or I both called various friends that we knew were very close with him, who might have some information about where he was. We thought, well, maybe he's just, at wit's end about this cancer, so maybe he went to Carol's home. Maybe he went to whomever's home. And no one had seen him.
The messages, text or voicemails that you or Jamie are leaving Thursday evening for Jonathan Broyhill, Jamie still has this meeting first thing in the morning?
She does.
Is that meeting and the FEC report, the work that needs to be done, is that being addressed at some point in these messages to?
Well, I know that she expressed, and I may have gotten frustrated and expressed as well, that this meeting was going on, that, she needed this information. She needed him at the house after the game. And we just never heard from him. As the night went on, it became more of a concern about his health. Did he get in a car wreck? Because we just weren't hearing from him. At some point that evening, she had emailed John Wallace and pushed the meeting to Monday because of him not showing up.
Your wife go to bed that Thursday night. I mean, what's the kind of last time you recall y'all are up and then just no response?
We were up pretty late. I mean, Jamie was really, in particular, concerned. I was concerned as well, but I was just like, I think he's going to show up. Jamie's going to be okay. So we went to bed pretty late. I mean, it was probably around midnight, maybe a little later, and we still hadn't heard from him at that point.
Let's talk about Friday, the day after lab court.
So Friday, I went into the office, and at some point that morning, I got an email from the defendant, which was the first contact we had had since he left our home.
Tell us about any contact you have with Jonathan Broyhill Friday morning.
He indicated that he just really felt like, he needed to get away, and that he had gone to the beach. He was sorry he had worried us. He was sorry he didn't pick up. He was sorry he didn't text. That he would be back Saturday or Sunday to help Jamie with the report. I can't remember if he relayed in that email or if it was a later phone conversation or text. He relayed that his appointment that they had said they could fit in on Friday, they actually couldn't have fit in on Friday anyways. So it was going to be the next week. But he kept on reassuring us, don't be worried. I'm just at the beach. I just need to get away. I'll be back.
Did he tell you? Do you have some conversations, whether they're text or phone calls? Do you think? Does he tell you about what happened at lab court?
I can't remember if it was in the email or if it was on a phone call. But anyways, he indicated that LabCorp had laid him off or had fired him. And he said that with the presumed cancer diagnosis and with his being fired from LabCorp, he was just at the end of his rope. That he just freaked out and needed to get away. He said he couldn't remember traveling to he basically indicated he just threw his phone in his bag. He just barely could remember even going to the beach, but he just knew he needed to get away.
Can you tell you what beach you went to?
I can't recall now which beach.
LabCorp.
But he said he rented just a motel room down there, and he would be back.
LabCorp terminate. Did he tell you that? Did he get? Last you saw, he was going
to
LabCorp. His computer. Did
yes.
he tell you some more details about his termination?
He just indicated that he showed up to get his laptop, and whomever was there told him that he was gone. He'd missed too many days. He was there too infrequently, and that he just couldn't not to come back to work.
Have a conversation. Is there some so it's Friday sometime in the morning. He's reconnected with you and Jamie.
Yes, he said that he would come home home to Raleigh, either on Saturday or Sunday, but not to worry, he'd be home in time to help Jamie with the report that was due on Monday. And he had offered to dog sit for us for several days while we would be gone on our anniversary, just the two of us. And so he said he'd be back in time to take care of the dogs. We had to push back our trip to the beach by a day to accommodate the rescheduled Wallace meeting.
It was important for the Wallace meeting, and he also had the hospital.
He told us at some point, Jamie first wanted me to pass along to him, since I was in communication with him, that, one of us at least, to try to schedule his meeting for Monday, his doctor's visit. If he could not, one of us would try to come back from the beach, or both of us would try to come back from the beach to be with him. He said he didn't want to worry his family yet until he knew for sure. And he really, I think, hadn't told many friends, if any. And so basically, anyways, we would schedule his doctor's visit for that Monday if he could at all, so that we could be present and then leave for the beach.
shared with you and Jamie about the cancer issue?
He had, yes.
Okay. But your knowledge, had he shared that with the other friends, if you know, at this point, a few days after the?
Well, I knew that he had told Nancy Petty, or Reverend Petty. I believe that this was the time that he had also told Maureen. God, I can't think of her last name. Maureen was
Worthingham?
yeah, Wertheim,
Worthington.
who was a cancer survivor. I know at some point, either that week or the next week, he would tell her. Just because I remember that being, she had had cancer before, and she was trying to help him think through, like, here's what chemo's like. And I think she'd even offered at that point, because he was worried that Donna was going to sell the house. She had offered, I think, Maureen also offered at that point that he would be able to move in with her if he wanted to during his treatment.
All right, we're going to go ahead and take our lunch recess now, and we'll resume at 2:30. Ladies and gentlemen, again, please recall the instructions. Don't talk among yourselves or with anyone else about the case. Don't form or express opinions about the outcome. No media or independent investigation into these matters, and please have no conversation with parties, witnesses, or lawyers. If you'll gather in the deliberation room at 2:30, please leave your notepads on your chairs. Everyone else, please remain seated while the jurors excuse themselves. Mr. Hahn, you may step down. Anything that we need to take up outside the presence of the jury?
Not from the state, Your Honor.
All right, very well. We'll be in recess then until 2:30.
Superior Court stands in recess till 2:30.